Well, hey everyone, it's Nate here with episode 285 of the Vinyl Guide. Today on the show we have Catherine Meyer, an author, journalist, and co-founder of the UK Women's Equality Party, and was also married to the late Andy Gill of Gang of Four. Now, you may already know that Andy was a friend of the show, appearing on episode 155 in early 2019 to discuss his then upcoming tour of Australia and delve, of course, into many of the vinyl record history and stories and things that we cover here on the show. If you haven't already, I recommend you check out this interview. Andy was so brilliant, and his music remained so influential to many, including myself, that it was such a wonderful moment for the show and, of course, for me personally as well. Now, what happened after that Australian tour was quite tragic. After a few postponements, Gang of Four finally played Australia in late 2019 and then left our shores to play a few dates in mainland China before heading back to the UK, at which time many members of the touring party, including Andy, became ill with a mysterious respiratory infection, which Andy never recovered from. Now, this is in late December 2019, January 2020, and unfortunately, Andy passed from this illness on February 1st. The evidence now suggests that Andy may have been amongst the first people to succumb to COVID-19, which would challenge the official timeline that many of us have heard from various news sources. Now, originally, Catherine was coming onto our show today to talk about The Problem of Leisure, a wonderful tribute album to Andy's music and Gang of Four, and it was already underway before Andy passed. She tells the story of the album today, as well as the book Good Grief, which she wrote in the months after Andy's passing. But today, Catherine also talks about the illness, the passing. She shares some stories about Andy and some of the fun tales of the musicians that he worked with and so much more. Catherine's a very much respected author and journalist and has had an amazing career. And she's been so brave with all that's happened in the last 18 months. And today, she wanted to just talk about Andy, share the story of the recordings, and I'm thankful that she reached out to tell it here on the Vinyl Guide. Now, normally I take ad breaks in the middle of the interview and talk about show sponsors. I'm not going to do that today. Let me just ask you all now to check out The Problem of Leisure, a celebration of Andy Gill and the music of Gang of Four. It's available now. Listen to it on streaming services and grab a physical copy from your local record shop. Also, Catherine's book is called Good Grief, Embracing Life at a Time of Death. Please check that out for her story, as well as getting advice on how to handle the topic around those who have recently been impacted by loss. And with that, let's talk to Catherine Meyer. Hello, hello.
Good morning, or good afternoon.
It's
for you.
good evening almost here.
Good evening. Yeah. Sorry.
No worries. How are you this morning?
I'm okay, thank you. I'm a little emotional because this is actual publication. You can tell I'm an author rather than a musician. It's release
Go
day.
live. Yes.
Yeah, exactly.
I just turned to my streaming service and I noticed that all the gaps that I had are now filled in. It's all here. Yeah. Well, look, I'll start off by saying I'm not very good at dealing with grieving and loss. I've been fortunate enough not to have dealt with it too much. I'm just giving you a heads up. I'm quite emotional, and if we may get into areas that I may get quiet on, and it's just me collecting my thoughts. So, don't please.
No worries at all. There's nowhere that I'm worried about going in our conversation.
Okay, all right, fair enough. And obviously, if you need a break, let me know as well.
Yeah.
I guess I do want to talk about Andy, and I do want to talk very thoroughly about the Problem of Leisure album. But first, you've gone through this process with your husband and partner passing. You've even written a book on the subject of grieving. As someone, again, like myself, who's increasingly knowing people who have loved ones that pass and dealing with people in the community who's suffering loss, what's the right thing to say?
So when I wrote the book, I actually wrote the book with my mother because I lost my stepfather just a few weeks before Andy. So my mother and I were widowed in very quick succession at the start of the pandemic. And we found a lot of commonalities in what we were experiencing in terms of people not knowing what to say to us as the newly bereaved. Mm-hmm. So in some ways, it's easier for me to tell you what what people should avoid. One of the most natural questions to ask, but also one of the most difficult to answer, is the very straightforward question on the surface: how are you? How are you forces you as the person who's grieving into a position either of saying, I'm fine. I'm just fine.
It's a reaction,
because
yeah. Okay.
Yeah. And you either kind of give a meaningless reaction like that, or it turns you in on yourself. And the thing about coping with the world when you've lost somebody, and grief is a very strange animal, and it takes all these different forms, and it's quite rapid cycling. So you can be absolutely fine one minute and a basket case the next. And the problem with the how are you question is it forces you to stop and take stock, possibly at exactly a point where you're just trying to be functional. And the last thing you want to do is be turning inward, because you do that enough on your own. So my advice really is, I think I have never in any of this process felt anything other than delight when people wanted to talk about Andy, to share memories of Andy, to talk about what he meant to them. And I've also never felt anything but supported by people who actually just kind of treat you in almost with normality. So one of the other problems, particularly because I was widowed just before the first lockdown here, so living on my own, and then immediately locked in on my own. And the only kind of contact were all these awful Zoom calls. And people, again, they felt that they had to treat me with a sort of high seriousness, as if I wasn't allowed to try and have light relief. So they would be doing some sort of calls that were social, silly things like quizzes or whatever. They would never invite me to those things. They would try and have these very serious one-to-ones. And actually, when you're trying to get through, particularly those early days, the kind of support you need is people to allow you to have what limited relief from your grief you can have by having conversations also about other things. And you also need practical help, which was a lot harder during the pandemic. But if people hadn't been sending me food parcels, I suspect I really would not have eaten during those first days and weeks. And, so that kind of practical support and helping with things like funeral arrangements or anything like that is just marvelous. So yeah, and my mother and I compiled a list in the book of some of the worst things people said to us, and some of them are just hilarious.
Okay, share some.
Well, so for example, there was a very lovely woman, and I discussed with her before telling the story, and I didn't name her, but people dig themselves into these terrible holes, and she basically said, did I now regret my decision not to have children? And then she realized what she'd said, and she said, listen, I think I regret my decision to have children. You can borrow my children, please borrow my children. It's like, that's not the most, it was very funny. But also people said, people have the wrong words come out. So people kept telling me to get well soon, as if I had, had a stomach upset or something. So calls would end with "get well soon," and then I think the single most tasteless one, but it made me laugh a lot, was a friend. I actually lost I've lost a lot of people, so I'm kind of, I can't say I'm used to. You don't get better at dealing with grief, but you do at least know what to expect. And
You've gone through the cycles a few times.
I've gone through the cycles. Nothing like losing Andy. That's losing my life, really. But with I lost my best friend and my stepsister within a month of each other a couple of years ago, and a friend of Andy's and mine was had gone out with my best friend. And as I mentioned, I also lost my stepfather, John, just before Andy. And this guy sent me a very nice sort of letter of condolence, but then he signed off, "Tell Andy to say hi to Sarah and John." I still can't believe he wrote that.
So it sounds like if we're dealing with someone who's had a major loss, rather than saying "how are you," which seems to be, confusing at the least, it's maybe the correct motion there is, "How can I help? Is there anything that I can do?" Or,
exactly. How can I help is particularly if you can help, even in small practical ways, but otherwise just like, as I say, I mean, lockdowns have complicated this, but what I really most wanted to do was just sort of hang out with people. One of the things, particularly for me, losing Andy, who, when I say he was my life, I mean, we spent so much time together, and it's the quiet things that you do together that I still have no idea how one would replace them. Like, yes, it's the going out and having fun or whatever, but it's like, I still can't watch TV, because watching TV on my own, I just pretty much, I will inevitably fall asleep and then wake up with a crick neck, not knowing what I've watched. But it's not fun. There are things that are kind of quiet communal things to do, sitting around on a Sunday morning, going through the papers, that sort of stuff. So one of the nice things for me in lockdown was we were allowed to have bubbles here, so small. If you were like me, if you were locked down alone, in the second lockdown, you were allowed to form a bubble with another household where they effectively became your household. So I formed a bubble with my surviving best friend, and I saw her family once a week. And it was just such a lovely thing, because I would go there, and there was never, I didn't have to ask if I could go there. It just became an arrangement. So I think one of the things, if you lose someone, is you don't just lose the person, though that's obviously the main thing, but you lose great chunks of what you did with your life without thinking about it. And so you need to reconstruct the stuff that you would just do, as I say, in quiet ways. And so anyway, I mean, it's writing the book. I mean, another thing that I really wanted to tackle, and I mean, we called the book Good Grief, and I kept saying what my mother's involvement was, that she started writing these letters to my stepfather after he died, to tell him about all the extraordinary things that were going on in the world. So when my publisher came to me and asked me to write a book about Andy, I said, I don't want to, it's too early, but why don't you instead publish these letters of my mother? And I showed the letters to her, and she said, actually, I'd love to publish these, but you need to write the book around it. And I wasn't sure I did want to write, but then when I started, I found I had a huge amount to say. And mostly what I had to say, mostly the book is about Andy. It although it's called Good Grief, it's really a love story about Andy. But the reason it's called Good Grief is people think grief is something that you want to hurry through. They believe in this notion of the stages of grief, that you have to kind of like hit marks, as it were. So you move on from denial to anger to the, and the idea is to expel the grief. And I want to tell people that isn't the case at all. First of all, however you grieve is the right way to grieve for you. But second of all, grief is an extension of the love that you had for the person. And so you don't want to get rid of it. You want to make it livable. So for me, making Andy as much a part of my life now that he's not actually physically here has been a goal. It's that. And I know people are uneasy with some of this. I talk to him. Some people would say that's a sign of madness. He's.
I've had a very good friend pass 5 years ago, And I still have conversations with him in my head. I still haven't brought myself to delete his number out of my phone.
Oh, exactly. It's hard to do that.
I don't think I ever will. I don't know. I can't imagine a time where I would. It just seems so final for me at that point. I mean, one of the things that happens as you get older, and if you are lucky enough, because this is actually a sign of luck to have people in your life that you love and with whom you have close relationships, inevitably some of them are going to die. And as you get older, more of them die. And I refer to them collectively as the lovely dead. And the lovely dead are a big part of my life. And it's not about being morbid. It's kind of the opposite. It's life affirming. So, the best friend, Sarah, who I mentioned, she wore this ridiculous, huge mushroom hat, which her children then gave to me after she died. And I tried wearing it once and I nearly got killed myself because you can't see a bloody thing. And I nearly stepped in front of traffic. So I decided, okay, I don't actually want to die for feeling close to Sarah by wearing her hat. So I made it into a lampshade. So nowadays, when I sit in my room upstairs, there's the fantastic portrait that Shepard Fairey made of Andy, where Andy looks very, very severe. So I'm always kind of saying to Andy, why the hell are you looking at me like that? And then, and I look across from that to the very funny lampshade, and it makes me laugh. And it's a joyful thing to do, not a depressing thing. I started this podcast as a response to my friend passing, because we used to have discussions about vinyl records. We used to listen to music together. And then when he passed in 2015, one of the things he did was he left me his record collection.
Oh, amazing.
And I for a while, I listened to them, and we shared a lot of the same tastes. And I started the podcast because I wanted to, continue those sort of conversations I used to have with Dan. And then I found myself looking at his records and thinking, something else needs to happen with these, because sitting on my shelf is nice, but that's of limited value. So I started finding his musical heroes. And we were, for example, the Zappa family. We were very much into Frank Zappa. I've had several of the Zappa kids on the show, and as part, sometimes, off air, off interview, we exchange information, and I send them some of Dan's records. And I've been able to do that to probably about a dozen different artists that Dan used to love, or Dan still loves, I assume, and they now have his exact records in their collection. So to me, that was a project, and I don't know what that means in the spirit of the universe, but I felt good doing it. It felt like I was doing honor to his memory that way.
But that's exactly right. What you don't want to do is just sort of, certainly I didn't want to do, is clear things. That another thing people think is you need to get rid of stuff. So I actually, again, lockdown maybe slowed this process a lot, because I couldn't invite people around to take Andy's things even if I wanted to. But his shoes are still at the end of the bed, and I will eventually move them. And again, it's not me being morbid. It's partly me being so bloody ridiculously busy with all the stuff that he landed me with, this bastard. But, it's also that in the end, I don't understand people's avidity to get rid of stuff. And what I actually saw some really good friends last night, two men that Andy was very, very close to. And I said to them, now that you can actually come into my house, please come and choose some clothes, because I would much rather that you had these clothes. And already my nephew, who loved Andy so much, is head to toe dressed in Andy most days, which I find very funny, because his feet are definitely bigger than Andy's, but his desire to be head to toe dressed in Andy means that I think he's probably going to cripple himself by having size 11 feet crammed into definitely smaller shoes.
So let's talk about that, because this tribute album, is it fair to call it a tribute album?
It is now, but it didn't start as a tribute album. Andy started this. So I had to turn it into a tribute album after he died. And it was already a celebration of Gang of Four, and it's become a celebration of Andy as well.
Right. And what condition was this album in at the time of his passing? Was it near complete? Was it fragments? What did you inherit at that moment?
You mean besides a massive headache? And so it was the thing that had obsessed him, his real passion project for the last 2 years of his life. It had started out as being something conceived of to mark the 40th anniversary of Gang of Four's debut album, Entertainment. And it had already transmogrified from that very quickly because Andy started approaching musicians who he loved and respected and asking them to do covers from Entertainment. And lots of these musicians came back and said, we'd love to do Gang of Four cover, but actually we want to do this song or this song that would not actually be on Entertainment. Mm-hmm. And indeed, for example, one of the tracks that Andy heard before he died was the one done by Robert from Massive Attack as 3D with Nova Twins, where the Nightingale sings, which is off a 2015 album that Andy wrote. So it had already moved to being a covers album. And at the point where Andy died, there were a lot of the tracks were already in, and there were more tracks than would have fit on a single album, but not enough for a double album. But Andy had a wish list of people he was still going to approach, some of whom he'd already talked to and hadn't delivered yet, and some of whom he hadn't yet approached. And so I just started working through the wish list and completed the project that way.
Who were some of those musicians that were on that wish list that contributed to the, what were some of those tracks?
Well, the very last one to come in is one of my, I mean, I love all the tracks on the album, but one of the ones that moves me most, as well as being one of my favorites, is Gail Ann Dorsey's version of We Live As We Dream Alone. So Gail, who's an extraordinary musician and probably best known for her work with David Bowie as his bass player for years. But, you know, she's also a great solo artist and done a lot of other stuff. But she was in Gang of Four, which a lot of people don't realise. And she and Andy were very, very close. And so that track and her version of it seemed to me the most perfect response in some ways, or echo of this isolation that we all felt during the pandemic. And so it's just an amazing thing. But she literally, you know, we were saying to her, if you don't get this in today, we can't include it, because we were doing the mastering and everything. And she worked all night to finish it. But it's an amazing thing. So that, you know, and then another, I think he had talked to, there's a big German artist on this record, Herbert Grönemeyer. He'd talked to Herbert about doing something. Again, he and Herbert were really good friends, but Herbert was off touring and whatever. So I went back to Herbert after Andy died and talked to him about it. And Herbert has also been particularly amazing with me, because when we first met him, it was when he'd moved to London. God, I guess back in the early 90s, probably. And he'd moved, actually, I can't remember when it was. My sense of time is so, but anyway, it's a very long time ago. He moved to London to try and have a normal, because he's so hugely famous in Germany, that he and his wife wanted to bring their kids up in a way that was outside that madness of fame. And as soon as they moved to London, so in this strange city where they didn't really know anyone, his wife, who had cancer, died very suddenly. So he ended up as a single parent bringing his kids up in a strange city. And he was friends with Anton Corbijn, who also at that time was living in London and was one of Andy's oldest friends. And so Anton introduced us in an attempt to try and, you know, give Herbert some life as a newly bereaved man. And so he not only contributed a track to this, but, you know, some of the best phone calls I had early on were from him, because of course he had been through it himself.
Yeah, I spoke to Andy in 2019. just as they were about to come out to Australia. And one of the things we spoke about was his participation in the Michael Hutchence solo album.
Yes.
Which, after Michael had died unexpectedly, Andy came in and had to sort through the pieces and pull that project together. And I imagine it was a very similar journey as the one you just went on, yeah?
Not only that, but that parallel has not escaped me. It through this wall here is sort of one room over. So right next to this wall is a room that's supposed to be a bedroom, but is actually full of master tapes. And I mean, anyone who lives with a musician or anyone who indeed likes vinyl as you do will know how much space this stuff takes up. But then through that is Andy's recording studio. And I so clearly remember Andy working through those, trying to finish the solo album. Most songs finished, quite a lot of the songs not only finished but mixed, but also then some wonderful fragments of songs. And the most extraordinary one was Slide Away, which sounds like Michael anticipating his own death. It has the lyric, "I just want to slide away and come alive again." And one of the things people, I think, wouldn't necessarily realize is that if you have those sort of fragments that haven't yet been mixed, you also tend to capture a lot of studio conversation on it. And there was a sound of them talking and Michael laughing, and that incredible laugh of Michael's, resonating through our flat. So Andy sitting there trying to put this back together, and Bono came in and did the vocal for that. So it's like it became a post-mortem duet with Bono. It will always stay with me because it was an act of love for Andy to do that. And he was utterly miserable and grief-stricken doing it, but he knew it was something that he wanted to do for Michael. And so, yeah, I mean, it would have been impossible not to recognize the parallels there.
Mm-hmm. After his passing, his studio, I assume, was still his workspace, just as he left it, assuming he would be back the next day or shortly thereafter. Did you find yourself having to go through tapes, maybe you or getting some people together to go through and to help you make sense of how he worked and where all these elements were?
Luckily, I mean, Andy and I were together for nearly 30 years, just shy of 30 years. So I think I had a very good understanding of how he worked, but I also had a very good understanding of the particular organized chaos of his writing process. So he had a table in the studio that was piled absolutely high with fragments of lyrics and ideas for songs and whatever. And then, of course, on the computer, there were tons and tons and tons of things that were songs that were in different degrees of being finished. And there's a lot of stuff he wrote that we still haven't done anything with, and I don't know if we ever will. But I was very lucky because there's a man who was involved in The Problem of Leisure in this album, who did quite a lot of the work on helping me get it together, who's called Santi Arribas, who's a musician and mixer and studio engineer, and he'd worked very closely with Andy. So I asked Santi actually to help me with the studio, and we've actually reopened the studio. I wanted Santi to use the studio because it obviously, one of the things that felt unnatural in the house after Andy went was, it wasn't just that Andy was such a huge presence here, it was that this is a live work space, and I have spent all my years with Andy with people traipsing in and out of our wherever we were living, out of our home, and always a lot of kind of community going on. And I wanted there to be life in the studio again, and it's so nice for me that's what's happening.
So it sounds like the problem with Leisure was certainly largely conceived. Even tracks were shared. Andy had heard most of the album, it sounds like, and I assume was quite happy with where it was going. What sort of decisions did you have to make to complete the record?
Oh, lots of decisions. I mean, including what kind of distribution deal, a lot of stuff around artwork. I mean, he'd decided so Damien Hirst did the artwork and while Andy was in hospital, he had sent over, he didn't know Andy was in hospital. We were being very secretive about it. And he'd sent over various designs, and Andy had chosen that marvelous dog that's on the cover. But there then needed to be all sorts of different variations on that. And we decided things, so working with Damien, decided things like vinyl covers and designs for all these different, so there are 3 different vinyls, there are 2 different CDs, and there's even a cassette tape, and each of those have different design elements. Decided, as I say, how to do the distribution, whether to do one of those old-fashioned record deals or do something that Andy didn't like old-fashioned record deals. He had moved quite some time ago to doing sort of label services type deals. Mm-hmm. And so I wanted to stay as close to what Andy would have done with all of this as possible. So, oh God, so many decisions. Andy had written a track listing, but a track listing based only on what he knew that there was, as opposed to what there would eventually be. Mm-hmm. I worked with Andy's former manager, came on board and is helping me, because the estate itself is deeply complicated, as you can imagine. And Andy didn't know he was going to die. So it's not like this was a man whose affairs were in order. Mm-hmm. So, there's just been a huge amount of work there as well. But yeah, I mean, in terms of everything, the great thing has been to be able to talk to Santi, to talk to the manager who'd worked with him closely, to talk with the last lineup of Gang of Four. Mm-hmm. Andy was incredibly close to them. They knew his thinking on everything. And I'm Thomas McNeice, the long-term bass player for Gang of Four. Wonderful, wonderful man. And he is himself a producer, a musician. He and Andy were very, very close. They had a lot of conversations about music. The John Sterry, who was the singer for the last sort of 8 or so years of the band, they actually co-wrote a lot of stuff. So I had all these people that I could go to say, I think this is what Andy would do, but can you please check this? Do you think this is right? Do you think this is in the spirit of? So, yeah, we had a kind of Andy brains trust, if you like. Yeah. And even down to, the people that the team who are helping promote the record, they're all people that Andy worked with. Mm-hmm. And it means, I know this sounds soppy, but there's just a lot of love for Andy in all of this, because there's nobody involved in this who didn't know and love him. And that's kind of, it also means we don't have to have all the awkward conversations about who he was or anything, because they all know.
Yeah. I would imagine if you're following the path in these decisions of what would Andy do, it seemed to me, in my very limited dealings with him and watching his career, he was so outspoken. I think that his intentions and his what he would want as an outcome would probably be pretty evident. Is that fair?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, Andy was one of the sweetest, nicest, and funniest people alive, but he also was not short on opinion. He was. And he was such a perfectionist. So I think the only times I ever think he'd disagree with anything that I've done is, I think I feel like he should be doing this interview. I don't really, I have a bit of imposter syndrome talking about the music, because obviously it's Andy, and I want Andy to be out there. And so I have some conversations with him about that. His ashes are here in a big wine flagon, which was the obvious. He needed to be in an appropriate vessel. And some of the reviews, I don't know if you've seen them, but the reviews have been spectacularly good.
Mm-hmm.
So I take the reviews up to him and I read the reviews out.
Oh.
And I think so. I'm pretty sure he'd be really happy with how all of this has turned out, and his criticism would be reserved for me, because he used to tease me about how often when I'm being interviewed I say and like, and basically all of which I've probably already done quite a few times now.
By the way, I'm hypersensitive to those, and you're not doing that much at all.
Okay.
So he had heard quite a bit of this project. Do you recall some of his memories or comments on these songs?
Yeah, I mean, I just remember, so when he was in his hospital bed was when he heard the version of Not Great Men by Flea and John Frusciante with the Silver Lake
Children's Choir.
Yeah, it's a children's choir. And he just, he was going, this is the most bonkers thing I've ever heard. This is absolutely bonkers, but it's brilliant. And he loved it, but he was like laughing and going, this is so mad. So he really loved it. But I mean, he loved that Idols version, which of Damaged Goods, which opens the album. He chose that to open the album, and it was, again, he thought it was absolutely fabulous. But I think the reason he wanted it to open the album was that he said that it was something that so perfectly combined being utterly Gang of Four in some respect, and yet completely the artists themselves had made it their own. Mm-hmm. And so he liked that in terms of cover, but he loved, La Rue has also done a version of Damaged Goods, and La Rue, whose real name is Ellie Jackson, he loved Ellie as a person and as an artist, and he completely loved her version of it. And she actually recorded or did some of the work on it here when Andy was still alive. And I remember them having very enthusiastic conversations about how she'd taken it and made it her own. So that was how he was. I mean, he heard a lot of those things. He loved the Dandy Warhols track. He was listening to Nightingale, the Robert from Massive Attack, and Nova Twins is one of the last things he listened to. Absolutely loved that. Yeah, he was. It was such an exciting thing for him to hear his own music reinterpreted that way.
I spoke to Andy about his work with Killing Joke. And then I spoke to Jazz about his work with Andy. And I've noticed that there is a track here, Killing Joke and Gang of Four, Forever Starts Now. Can you tell me a bit about that?
Well, Forever Starts Now is the track was actually released posthumously as a Gang of Four track. And Killing Joke have done this sort of fantastic, that's more of a remix than a cover, I suppose. And it's brilliant. But yes, Andy loved working with Killing Joke. He produced a whole album of theirs here, in that studio just over there. And I don't know what Jazz said about it, but it's one of the funnier. They were here for a very long time, and it's one of the funnier periods in the studio, because they, in particular, Jazz. That I was going to say they're such wild men, but Youth is kind of quieter, but Jazz is a real wild man, and he's very sociable. And so we'd lived in the neighborhood we live in quite kind of deliberately, inconspicuously, and Jazz would decide to invite everyone he'd just met in the local pub back to ours. And we had my favorite thing that ever happened when Jazz was there was he invited some bloke back who he'd met in the pub, who was already quite the worse for wear and had a big row with his girlfriend. So I think Jazz felt sorry for him, because he just split up with his girlfriend. And so this kind of drunk guy came in, and he had a very wilted bunch of flowers, and he kind of thrust it at me and said, "I don't have any use for this anymore." And it's like, what it was, they weren't nice flowers to begin with. They were sort of garage forecourt flowers. So I just put them in the bin. And then he and Jazz were down in the studio, and then eventually he left, and eventually they all left, and Andy and I went to sleep. And then the doorbell started ringing at about midnight. And this guy was there even drunker. And he said, "I've got back with my girlfriend. I need the flowers." So I had to go and get these now completely dead flowers out of the bin and give them to him. And he staggered off into the night with the dead flowers to give to his girlfriend, with whom he was going to just reunite. So, yeah. That's my. That was having killing joke. Yeah.
I commend you on your patience at moments like that. So in terms of, now you mentioned that there's some other recordings. You don't know if you're going to get to them. Is there a lot there? Is it significant? Is it an album's worth? Is it a few songs? What does it look like?
It probably, but I think that's where on this, it was possible to know exactly what Andy wanted and to finish his vision and deliver it as he would have wanted it. With what's there, I don't want to start kind of playing around with his legacy, if you know what I mean. So we released, after Andy died, we actually very quickly released something. But one of the reasons we did that was we wanted to raise money for the hospital that looked after Andy so well and tried so hard to save him. And we also knew there were some beautiful finished or semi-finished things that we felt should go out there to remember him, and that it would be true to his memory and enhance, it's not enhance, you can't enhance the memory of somebody like Andy. It needs no enhancing, but, that it
further,
would be... Yeah. And what I don't want to do is start kind of doing things that would have the opposite effect. So I think when lockdowns are really finally over, and when maybe, Thomas and John Sterry, who I mentioned, can come and really listen to what we've got, then we could have that conversation. But I'm certainly not going to rush to put more stuff out. There's such a huge Gang of Four catalogue. I mean, Andy was, and there's, if people are interested in Andy, he produced so many albums and records as well. That what I don't want to do is sort of add to that pointlessly when there's so much for people to discover. I mean, he was the only member of the band who was in it right from the start and to the moment that he died. The original singer, John King, left in 2010. And so there's just, there's from the late 1970s right the way to 2020's worth of music. And Andy didn't like the way some bands sort of turned into karaoke versions of themselves. And he never wanted to stop exploring musically. And he never could have stopped writing music even if he'd wanted to, because it just was something that he was driven to do, and it happened. And so I would hesitate to intervene in what he's done, because there's just already so much. Right. And it's so great. And he had, as we were just saying, strong opinions. He was a perfectionist. The reason he didn't just create all of this amazing music, one of the things I love about the physical version of this album is that I was able to include an extract from a eulogy given at his memorial by his best friend, who's the filmmaker Adam Curtis, who knew Andy from school and understood that Gang of Four had already been groundbreaking. They had created a sort of new way of doing music, but that Andy had done something also extraordinary as a guitarist, and that was to create a sound that was absolutely individual and absolutely his own. And it's so strangely recognizable. You literally just need to hear a couple of notes and you know it's Andy.
Now, you mentioned, or I've read reports where you think that Andy was one of the first victims, possible first victims of COVID. Is that correct? Okay.
Well, so as you know, because you talked to him when he came to tour in Australia in 2019, in November, he was touring in Australia, New Zealand, Japan, and China. Mm-hmm. And he came back from that and seemed fine, but then got ill with what seemed like a kind of flu-like thing, then appeared to get a bit better, but then got a lot worse. And at the time, nobody thought it could be COVID because obviously in December was when the first reports of COVID were coming out, and it was supposedly contained within Wuhan, and they hadn't been to Wuhan. And when he was admitted to hospital in January with what was immediately diagnosed as pneumonia, they assumed that they would be able to treat him very easily, get him back out of there. And they asked about China, but they immediately dismissed it because of the timelines and the information on COVID. And also, there was very little understanding of how the disease progresses. So there was the thought that you would get it and then immediately become very ill and die straight away. Mm-hmm. That was the sort of story that was coming out. And so when, after he died, the internet rumors started about him having COVID, I was actually distressed by that, and I pushed back against it. And it was only later when evidence emerged not only of COVID having reached Europe in December, but community transmission of COVID in December, which has been proven. That's not a kind of conspiracy theory. It's in France, they tested blood samples of patients taken in December in their hospitals and discovered active COVID. So clearly the Chinese timelines are a nonsense. It was only then that I went back to the hospital that had tried to save Andy, and I said, you may think I'm mad. I emailed his specialist and I said, you may think I'm mad, but could he have had COVID? And they said, we didn't want to get in touch with you until we had a chance to do more investigation, but we've been investigating this for the past 6 weeks. And we think, for all the reasons that I'm now about to tell you, that is very probable. And one of the reasons that they thought it is because of the course of his illness. They were now very familiar, by this stage, familiar with what happens to people who have COVID, but also his lung scans. There's a very distinct way that COVID lungs look that is quite different from other things, and that was how his lungs looked. But they will never be able to definitively say whether he had it or not, because they didn't have the right tissue samples available to test. But, it would be a rather bizarre coincidence for him to come back from China and then get ill like that and then have something that looked exactly like COVID. He lost his sense of taste and smell. There are so many things.
Kind of ticking all the boxes.
It ticked all the boxes. So yes, and the reason I went public with it, when I discovered this, I didn't want, in some ways, to go public with it because I didn't want Andy's name associated with something as awful as COVID. But I realized, as soon as I realized that he had probably, I think there's no probable for me. I think he died of COVID. And there's other stuff, like I didn't know it at the time, but the young tour manager came back from England and ended up being admitted to hospital with severe respiratory distress about a week after their return from China. Lots of people in our group of friends were early COVID people, had again these very classic symptoms, etc. So, it's as close to definite as it can be. I decided that I did need to go public, because what it made me realize was that if Andy had had it, then the timelines were wrong. And if the timelines were wrong, and so many people around us had got symptoms and some of them had got ill, but then so many people like me had not done so, that what people understood of the disease was wrong. And the only way you can have an effective public health response is to understand what you're dealing with. And so that's why I went public, because I felt that the public interest trumped any personal and private interests there.
It's important. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Okay. Well, look, Catherine, again, thank you so much for coming on the show and for opening up and sharing your memories of Andy and, of course, of the coming together of the album, The Problem of Leisure. You can listen to it on all streaming services. And, of course, you can order the album. There are CD and, of course, vinyl versions available at theproblemofleisure.com. You could also find them at gang-of-4.uk. I'd also recommend checking out Catherine's book, Good Grief, Embracing Life at the Time of Death. You can find that at any major book retailer or catherinemeyer.co.uk. Catherine, thank you so much for coming on the show, and God bless.
Thank you.
Well, there we go. Not a whole lot left to say, except thank you very much, Catherine, for coming on the show and sharing those memories of Andy. And to everyone listening, the album is called The Problem of Leisure, a celebration of Andy Gill and the music of Gang of Four. It's available now. It's on streaming services. It's on physical form media. There's a ton of great artists on there as well. Tom Morello, Serge Tankian, Helmet, Gary Newman, the Dandy Warhols, Flea, John Frusciante, Killing Joke, Idols. Man, the list goes on. Check it out. The Problem of Leisure, a celebration of Andy Gill and the music of Gang of Four. And of course, Catherine's book is called Good Grief, Embracing Life at a Time of Death. Thanks again for listening to this episode of The Vinyl Guide. Be well, look after one another, and we'll be back shortly with a brand new episode. Cheers.